Yo, parish orphans and retrogrades. As we prepare for the upcoming conclave of cardinals where they will pick the 267th Pope, I have been putting together notes and thoughts and reflections because folks out there need to know the number one thing, the number one tell or determinant for this conclave is something that has been relevant to the church for the last 55 or 60 years and should definitively or semi-definitively answer a big question. I'm going to be talking about what that question is in today's show. I think you're really going to find it useful. I'm going to also read out for you, I think, the best place you can go if you're interested in the prospective cardinals who are candidates for being the 267th Pope. There's a great site that my publisher, Sophia Institute Press, collaborates on. It's really, really tremendous, and I'm going to be reading some of the information from that site as well today. But the most important aspect of today's episode is an answer to the question, what exactly will we need to bear in mind first most heading into this conclave, and what will that determinant tell us about the men who are leading the church themselves? And of course, it also, if we can read the tea leaves correctly, tell us yay or nay, will we actually get a good pope, a really good pope for the first time after the council 1965. It's going to be a great show. So today's show involves the number one tell, the number one determinant at this conclave, and what we ought to be looking for as concerned Catholics. Even the citizens of the world are interested. For instance, CNN is paying me a visit at my home on Monday. They're going to be filming. There's a great religious reawakening where America is turning to Catholicism. I said this needed to happen if America is to survive in my first book, Catholic Republic, Why America Will Perish Without Rome. Folks, it's slowly happening. This Easter, we had record diocesan numbers of entries into the faith. Now, that's a bit of a white pill, but don't go too far with that. There's a lot more that needs to happen before we've made it out of the woods. That's that. The point is, even interested parties like CNN, who just want to know who's going to be the next leader of the church, are coming, and there's like, hey, can we film you? This footage will either go on Anderson Cooper's show. They're going to ask me what is important to Roman Catholics. And my answer is partly constitutive of the show today. What do Catholics actually care about? The ones that are serious, not the ones in the 80s and the 90s that were like old me, which was ironically young me, raised in the church in the 80s and 90s in a half-hearted way, in a perfunctory way. Half of my heart fully was not even into what I was learning. I was in Catholic school, but I didn't believe any of it. None of my friends did. All my friends at St. Francis, St. Mark's, Jesuit of Dallas, pretty much all of them fell away from the faith. And that's very typical of the 80s or 90s, or the decade before I was born, the 70s experience. In short, the post-conciliar experience, the experience of what happened to the church after the Second Vatican Council. It claimed it was going to bring lots of new people in, and all it did was drove a bunch of people away. There were enough people in before. So, CNN's going to come visit me. You might be able to see that footage on Anderson Cooper's show. My whole point in bringing it up is just to demonstrate exactly what can be told at this point in church history, in salvation history. And what can be told is something about the personnel themselves. I want to play for you. Here's what it is. It's something we've been needing to know since the close of Vatican II. Drum roll, please. What I think that thing is that we need to know, that desideratum, are these cardinals, a couple generations of them, 3, over the last 55 or 60 years since, I don't care whether you count it from the close of the council in 65 or the rolling out of the council's new mass in 69, 70, I don't care, 55 or 60 years. Are these cardinals of the past 6 decades evil or clueless? There's no other real solution, because what the effects of the Second Vatican Council did, irrespective of the fact that it doesn't contain, in my view, any heresies or anything like that, what it did was drive people away from the church, make the people who stayed in the church not believe in the sacrament of the Eucharist, which made, because all the other 6 sacraments subserve it, it made them disbelieve in all the other 6 sacraments as well. It also forced a kind of lazy, drifters class of unbelieving men into the priesthood. Let's leave it at that. And both the clergy and the lay alike has been living in a kind of Jimmy Carter era malaise since the close of the council, maybe the start of the council, definitely the close of the council or 70. So the men who run the church, forget the Pope for a minute, he's on top of the pyramid, but the men who run the church, they are literally, I'm borrowing language from Julius Caesar, from the tragedy of Caesar by Shakespeare. They're fat and happy. Even the conservatives. I remember even 10 years ago, one of my conservative friends telling me he thought Cardinal Schönborn, who's one of the minor papabile going into this cardinal, was a conservative. Oh, he helped write the Catechism of the Catholic Church in the early 90s. He helped Ratzinger. When Ratzinger was hailed as this big arch conservative. Neither of those guys are, strictly speaking, conservatives. Schönborn's a liberal. Ratzinger's kind of center, sometimes center left, sometimes center right, but they were all Rahnerites, which is liberal theologians. So given that the church has been horrible and the cardinals, the leaders of the church, have remained through the church's worst period ever, the last 60 years, fat and happy, are they just clueless or are they outright evil? Cluelessness has been their closest approach to a defense for the ship that they've just let fall into disrepair. It's supposed to be a tight ship with hospital corner beds, newly scrubbed planks on the floor, sparkling countertops, the mast flies high, crisp in the wind, and they've let it degenerate into a ruin that barely stays afloat, the bark of Peter. And meanwhile, the crew of the ship is off engaging in degeneracy, oftentimes with each other, Homo sapien degeneracy. And, let's say that, I don't know how to extend this analogy anymore. The laity are just fatherless. That's why I address you guys, parish orphans. Parish orphans. We have been parish orphans since before I was born. I was born a parish orphan. We do not have priests, bishops, cardinals that do their job, by and large. I'm talking 99% of them. Something like 75, 80% of them through some periods of this time are living in habitual, grave, unnatural sin. But we won't talk about that today. So how will this conclave, this is the most important thing, how will this conclave answer this question? Are the cardinals of 55 or even 60 years ago, who aren't even alive today, are they evil or clueless? Cluelessness being the closest approach to a defense. Consider what Cardinal Dolan, Timothy Dolan of New York, said 2 days ago. I want to play this clip for you where he's intoning, he's a center leftist in the church. Again, 10 years ago, people were calling him a kind of center right guy. It's just idiotic. That's just not true. People didn't, at that point 10 years ago, understand how far left the church was on everything. And then, a lot's happened in the last decade. Taylor Marshall and I did this show, and that was kind of a red pilling for a lot of people. Wow, everything's way worse than we thought. Main thing people took from TNT. Cardinal Dolan is a center-left, kind of typical fat and happy guy, goes along with the LMNOP-Q movement. Remember, he said he had no right to judge the Homo sapiens who marched with him in the St. Patrick's Day parade. Yeah, you do. This is like the most grave sin, worse than murder, according to many of the doctors of the church. St. Peter Damian, it's far worse than murder. I don't want to judge them. So this is Cardinal Dolan, and he is sounding rather rightward leaning. Can we play that clip, please?
Yes, let me see.
What do you want to see in terms of the next pope?
Well, you'd always, when you get to be 75 like I am, you kind of got in your memory bank past popes. And you kind of are always dreaming of a blend of them. I'd love to see somebody with the vigor and the conviction and the fortitude of John Paul. I'd love to see somebody with the intellectual wattage of a Pope Benedict. I'd love to see somebody with the heart of a Pope Francis. How we can blend them all. We're not in some laboratory doing genetic mutations here, but that's probably what we would look for. Somebody with the same style of Francis, that warmth, that heart, that smile, that goodness, that embrace, and maybe within a little bit of a blend with John Paul and Benedict when it would come to more, what would I say, more clarity in teaching, more refinement of the church's tradition, more digging in the treasures of the past to remind us of what Jesus expects of us now. Probably a blend of the great popes that we've recently had. That's what we'd be looking for.
Okay, first thing, I just want to get this out of the way. None of these were great popes. My favorite pope in the post-conciliar era, personally, is Pope Benedict. We had high hopes those first years. It was while I was coming back into the church, 05, 06, 07. And, I had an ongoing reversion. I've told this story, which would continue for the next 5 years after 07. But I was coming back into the church and went to Rome to study under Benedict. We had high hopes in those days, thought he was a real conservative. Then we learned that he'd been a Raunerite as a young man. Then we learned that he never really ditched his Raunerism, theological liberalism from the time of the council. And that kind of prompted everyone to readdress Pope John Paul II. And whoa, he's even further to the left in terms of the kind of Rauner scale, communio, concilio, the kind of sliding scale of Vatican II liberalism. He was even further left than Benedict XVI. And then, of course, we had Francis, who's the furthest left pope in the history of the church, the worst pope, if he was pope at all, in the history of the church, the modern church anyway. No doubt about it. We still have to deal with this catastrophe of Amoris Laetitia, where it's still not quite clear, even though the language should make it clear. You can give communion to the civilly divorced and remarried. That means that mortal sin does not bar one from the Eucharist. That means impossibility. Paradox. So none of these are great popes at all. But still, Dolan's doing something, and I want to point out what it is. He's saying we should not take any doctrinal teaching from Francis. In fact, it's kind of insinuated by what he said. He left a mess that's going to have to be cleaned up. But then I want to take the vigor of John Paul II, and he can kind of make an appeal to center-right people who think like communism is a big problem in the world. Because JP2 was seen as one of the ardent defenders against communism, one of the ones even, according to some ways the story is told, who defeated it. It's a very boomer take. Now, the question is, what do we do about it? Well, what we should be looking for is to solve the Sphinx's riddle, at least since Vatican II. Are all of these physically fat, they eat well every night, fancy Italian food, fancy French cuisine, they're just eating out, dining out on everyone else's dime. Every night, they eat well. They're not lean fishermen like half the original apostles. They're not risking themselves. They're not even risking their good name with the citizens of the world over at MSNBC and CNN. So are they clueless or are they evil? We will know at this conclave. We're going to know because Francis was the truth outing itself. With Francis, all bets were off. With Pope Francis, the mask came off of the Vatican II agenda. Francis said we did not go far enough with the spirit of Vatican II. Francis said the old church needs to be rebuilt anew. Cardinal McCarrick, Uncle Ted Molester McCarrick, who was the guy that got Francis in position, more than even the St. Gallen Mafia, According to a speech he gave at Villanova University 6 months after Francis came in late 2013, he said, "It was me and a mysterious Italian gentleman, and we talked to each other, and we said, there's this unknown Bergoglio who can remake the face of the church if we gave him 5 years. In 4 or 5 years, he can remake the church into something wholly new, just what we wanted it to be." And of course, to understand what he's really talking about, you have to understand the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita. I might do a show on that in the coming days. Again, I love to do a kind of revisitation show with Taylor on this, because this is our time in a way. But the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita is the Masons of the world who said they wanted to infiltrate the church. It's an intercepted document by either Pius IX or Gregory XVI. We're not exactly sure who it was, but by the middle 1800s, we had the document, and multiple popes promulgated it. Said this is an intercepted document, and we look for interlopers in the church who are going to take the next 100 years, as the document says, and get someone into the pontificate that will serve the interests of the cardinalate. The cardinalate will actually be Masons. This was demonstrated by Pio Ponto and by actually the pontificate of John Paul I. The cardinalate was largely Masons. The powerful contingent was. The Pope doesn't need to be a Mason, but he needs to serve the agenda of the powerful Mason cardinals. That's the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita, intercepted document at the beginning of the 1800s, widely promulgated by 3 or 4 popes in the late 1800s, saying this is what's coming in the 1900s. By the way, yes, the Second Vatican Council was organized by guys in complicitude with this agenda. So we're going to find now that we have center leftists like Dolan saying things that are rightward leaning. Are they just bluffing? Are they going to give us another Francis? Or, which would mean a bluff, him having said something like this yesterday and then giving us a Francis would mean, okay, they're just buying themselves plausible deniability or time or something. I can't figure why he would do it, but it would be a bluff de facto. And that would mean, they're just evil. They want more of Francis. Or have they been, I'm not saying it's not evil, but have they been something more like clueless the last 3 generations of cardinals since the council? And they actually respond to new information when, say, the Pope that the Alta Vendita envisioned drops his mask, which is what Francis did. You know, the Lavender Mafia who gave us Francis, they were openly, we found out, dropping their pants. But the Pope that they gave us dropped the mask. That's what the Francis pontificate was. That's what the Francis pontificate was. And so now we will get, if guys like Dolan or, Mueller's definitely a little to the right of Dolan because he did come out as more a ballsy critic of Francis, but he's not much further to the right. Or guys like, Bishop Barron, who's not a cardinal, so he won't have a vote. But if those kind of, fat, contented, happy, benefiting by the church's ignorance, sort of salutary neglect from their perspective, cardinals, if they give us another Francis, then we will be able to authoritatively say it's post-mask drop now. Took 60 years for Vatican II, spirit of Vatican II, to really show itself. And now that it's shown itself to everyone, even the idiot normies that believe mainstream agenda, mainstream narratives, if they go with another Francis, that means 2/3 of these cats are evil.